Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales. Tonight we drift out across the widest stage the world has ever known, the open ocean. Long before engines erased distance and satellites traced every coastline, people pushed wooden hulls into unknown water and trusted the wind, the stars, and their own patient memory to carry them home. Every voyage was a quiet wager with the planet itself, and survival depended less on force than on listening to a world that does not speak in words. Tonight we will follow that long human curiosity as it left the safety of the shore. We will meet the navigators who read the waves, the instruments that turned fear into coordinates, the ships that vanished, and the ships that returned changed forever. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, let your shoulders soften and your breathing slow. Let the day loosen its grip and allow your thoughts to follow the tide gently outward. Let's begin. The oceans were mapped by people who could never see beyond the horizon. For most of human history, the only way to learn what lay past the edge of the water was to sail straight into it and come back to tell the tale. Mariners traced unknown coasts by watching the color of the sea, the shape of distant clouds, and the faint smell of land carried on the wind. They sketched a bay, marked a reef that nearly ended them, then returned years later to correct a single curve. Slowly, one careful shoreline at a time, these voyages stitched the continents together in the human mind. The map you picture today, with its confident outlines and familiar shapes, was not handed down whole. It was earned the slow way by people who worked at the very limit of what they could see, and who trusted that the blank space ahead was worth the risk of finding out. Polynesian navigators crossed a third of the planet without a single instrument, across the vast Pacific. Long before compasses reached those waters, master wayfinders treated the open ocean as a readable landscape. They memorized the paths of stars that rose and set in reliable places, and they matched those paths to the feel of the swells moving beneath the hull. They studied the flight of seabirds, the drift of clouds, and the color of the sky, weaving it all into a single sense of direction. This was not luck or guesswork, it was an accumulated science, carried in chants, in stories, and in years of apprenticeship at sea. When a canoe finally reached a small island lost in an enormous ocean, it proved something profound about the human mind. Knowledge could be portable, precise, and brave enough to cross an emptiness that offered no landmarks at all. Guided only by patterns the navigator held inside, they could feel invisible islands hidden in the pattern of the waves. Perhaps the most remarkable skill of the Pacific wayfinders was their ability to sense land they could not yet see. An island sitting in the path of ocean swells, bends and reflects those waves, sending faint echoes rippling outward for many miles. A trained navigator, lying quietly in the hull of a canoe, could feel these subtle crossings in the motion of the boat and understand that something solid lay ahead, still far beyond sight. It was a way of touching the world through the water itself, reading the ocean the way a hand reads texture in the dark. To an outsider, it looked almost like magic. In truth, it was a lifetime of attention distilled into instinct. The sea, so often imagined as featureless, turned out to be full of hidden shapes for those who had learned to listen to it with their whole body. Viking longships reached North America centuries before Columbus was born. The Norse built vessels that were light, fast, and remarkably flexible, able to ride an ocean swell and then slip up a shallow river. That versatility meant their exploring did not stop at the coastline. From Scandinavia they pushed to Iceland, then on to Greenland, and finally westward again, to a place now known as lawns or meadows on the northern edge of North America. The evidence there shows a real Norse presence long before later European voyagers crossed the same water. This was not achieved by magic, but by seamanship, timing, and a willingness to sail on nothing more than uncertain reports. Their journeys remind us that exploration often happens in patient steps, each small settlement becoming a launching point for the next, and they gently unsettle the neat stories we tell, showing that the Atlantic was crossed and crossed again long before it became a famous headline. Norse sailors may have found their way through cloud with a simple stone. On the northern seas, days can pass beneath a solid grey sky with no clear sun to steer by. Some researchers believe certain crystals, held up to the light, could reveal the hidden position of the sun through the way they bend polarized light, even when clouds covered everything. The idea remains debated, tangled with legend and hard to prove, yet it is a wonderful possibility. It shows how sailors will reach for anything that might reduce uncertainty, from the behavior of birds, to the shape of a wave, to a shard of glowing rock. Whether these sunstones were common tools or rare tricks, the story points to the same deep truth about long voyages. When you cannot see the sky clearly, you learn to read light itself, searching every corner of the visible world for one more clue to point you home. Arab and Swahili captains sailed by the steady breathing of the monsoon. In the Indian Ocean, the wind itself sets the schedule. The monsoon reverses direction with the seasons, so a voyage there is planned like a promise made to the sky. Sailors along the Arabian coast and the Swahili city-states learnt to leave when the winds would carry them outward, then wait and return when the winds swung around to pull them home again. This seasonal rhythm created a stable web of trade that linked East Africa, Arabia, India, and lands beyond. Ports became crowded, many-tongued meeting places where gold, ivory, spices, and stories all moved together. The knowledge that made this possible was practical and shared, passed down through generations of captains. To them, the ocean was not a fearful blank, but a timed corridor that rewarded patience and punished haste. When you understand the winds, a barrier becomes a bridge that opens, closes, and opens again. Phoenician traders carried the alphabet farther than they ever sailed. Their world was stitched together by harbors, headlands, and islands that demanded constant attention. They moved metals, glass, and a famous purple dye that took enormous labor to produce, becoming some of the finest sailors of the ancient Mediterranean. Yet their most lasting cargo was smaller than any jar. It was a simple system of writing that made records faster, deals clearer, and messages easier to copy. As their ships moved from port to port, sailors and merchants shared not only goods, but habits, words, and ways of counting worth. Over time, letters traveled farther than the people who first used them. A symbol scratched onto a shard in one coastal town could reappear in another, reshaped by new tongues and new needs. In this way, the sea roads became learning roads, carrying an idea small enough to fit in a human hand, yet large enough to reshape the world. The magnetic compass freed ships from the comfort of the shore. A compass seems almost too simple until you imagine relying on it when clouds hide the stars and no land is anywhere in sight. Its great gift was trust, a steady pointer that held its direction while the whole world tilted and rolled unpredictably. Chinese mariners helped develop and refine magnetic direction finding, then carried it out onto open water where the sight of land could no longer be relied upon. That reliability changed what a voyage could be. Ships could aim for distant targets with fewer stops, and merchants could plan routes that were not chained to the coast. The compass also changed the mood aboard ship, offering a calm reference point when fear rose or a storm scattered every bearing. It is a familiar pattern in the story of the sea. A tiny invention, quietly held in the hand, could make an unthinkable space feel manageable at last. Ancient Egyptians sailed the Red Sea for incense and rare wood. These were not gentle coastal outings. Crews moved through fierce heat, sudden winds, and hidden reefs that could grind a ship into splinters. Their goal was treasure you could smell and touch, resins to burn in temples and timbers that could not be found along the Nile. Reaching the water could be as hard as the sailing itself, since supplies had to be hauled across desert, hulls prepared, and departures matched to seasons that made a safe return possible. When an expedition finally came home, it proved that careful planning could stretch far beyond familiar borders and out onto open water. It also showed something tender about why people explore at all. A craving for sacred scent and strong wood was enough to pull ships toward the unknown, long before empires or glory. Sometimes the first step into a great voyage is nothing more than a simple human wish. Chinese treasure fleets once dwarfed the ships of every other nation. In the early years of the Ming dynasty, China launched vast voyages under the Admiral Zheng He. His fleets carried soldiers, interpreters, craftsmen, and diplomats, along with cargo meant to impress. They sailed through Southeast Asia and across the Indian Ocean, visiting ports where merchants already traded spices, textiles, and precious goods. These expeditions were about power as much as discovery. A great fleet arriving in a harbor could settle disputes, secure alliances, and broadcast the authority of a distant emperor without firing a single shot. Gifts flowed outward and tribute flowed back. A slow political theater performed upon the water. The sheer scale of the ships startled everyone who saw them, and later stories grew into legend. Even without perfect records, the message is clear. Ocean exploration was never only a European story. Great maritime powers rose in many places and used the sea as a stage. Greek thinkers argued fiercely about where the sea ended. Curiosity pushed the scholars of the ancient Mediterranean to treat geography as a puzzle that could be tested rather than simply believed. Sailors brought home distances, the shapes of coasts, and reports of strange currents. And thinkers tried to turn those scattered scraps into a single coherent picture. Some attempted early measurements of the Earth itself, using shadows and angles to reason about its size. Others debated what lay beyond the known waters, and whether the ocean was a boundary at the edge of the world, or a highway leading onward. These arguments were not idle, for a captain choosing a route needed real guidance, and a city planning trade needed maps it could believe. The tension between careful observation and bold speculation became part of the culture of exploration itself. Not every claim was correct, yet the method endured. Ask a question, gather what evidence you can, and accept that the sea may prove you wrong. Early sailors estimated their position by a hopeful guess called dead reckoning. The method feels reassuring because it uses only what a crew can see and feel. You take your speed through the water, your direction on the compass, and the time since your last known position, then add it all together to guess where you should be. On a calm passage, it could be remarkably good. The trouble is that the ocean keeps its own quiet arithmetic. Currents slide beneath the hull like invisible rivers, nudging a ship sideways without ever changing the wind in the sails. A tired sailor's rough guess at speed, a worn measuring line, or a small steady error in steering could all pile up into many lost miles, so a coast might appear with a shock, or fail to appear at all. Dead reckoning taught sailors a humbling lesson that the sea rewarded. You can navigate the water, but you can never fully bully it into obedience. Latitude could be read from the simple height of a star. On a rolling deck, precision is hard to win, yet the sky offered sailors a steady gift. By measuring the angle of a familiar star or the midday sun above the horizon, a navigator could work out how far north or south the ship had wandered. It did not solve every problem, and a heaving sea could turn a careful reading into little more than a guess. Still, it transformed the mental map of a voyage. A ship could now know its place along the great north to south lines of the world, which made return routes safer and long crossings far more confident. Observation became a nightly discipline, repeated and recorded and compared. Slowly, the heavens turned into a partner in navigation. When you can measure where you stand upon the world, the ocean stops being pure uncertainty. It quietly becomes a grid you can enter on purpose. The astrolabe turned the whole night sky into a measuring tool. This elegant instrument let a mariner capture the angle of a star or the sun and translate it into a position along the lines of latitude. It asked for a steady hand and a clear sky, and a rough sea could ruin a reading in an instant. Yet in calmer moments it gave sailors a new kind of certainty, a way to pin their place beneath the turning stars. More than a device of brass and markings, it represented a change in thinking. Finding your way became a matter of measurement and record, rather than pure instinct and memory. Night after night, a navigator could take a reading, note it down and compare it with the nights before, building a quiet ladder of numbers across the sea. The astrolabe made the sky feel a little less distant. It was proof that even the heavens could be enlisted to guide a ship home. Shipboard astronomy turned a rolling deck into a moving observatory. A clear night at sea can be astonishing, and for a navigator it was also a workplace. Careful observations of the stars helped fix a ship's position, calibrate its instruments, and check the accuracy of the clocks the whole crew depended on. Ships carried sextants, small telescopes, and tables of figures, and the work had to succeed despite wind, spray, and the constant motion of the sea. That effort pushed precision forward. Crews learned to standardize their procedures, record results consistently, and compare readings from one voyage to the next, since a small error in a star sighting could become a large error on a reef-strewn coast. In this way, ocean expeditions strengthened the quiet partnership between astronomy and practical navigation. The sky was not only beautiful, it was a reference system, and leaning on it helped make timekeeping itself more disciplined and more shared across the world. The cross staff measured the heavens and slowly stole its user's sight. This tool was simple in design and hard on the body that used it. A sailor held the long staff up to the face and slid a crosspiece along it until it lined up with both the horizon and a star, or the sun. Then read the angle from the markings. Used with stars at night, it could be managed. Used with the sun, it was dangerous, since staring toward that fierce light for reading after reading could quietly damage a navigator's eyes. Yet crews kept using it, because at sea the price of knowledge is real, and the price of ignorance is often higher. The cross staff shows the gritty truth behind the elegant stories of navigation. Instruments were never magic. They demanded steady hands, clear skies, and bodies willing to suffer a little for a better line on the chart. Great discovery was built from many small, uncomfortable moments like these. Longitudes stayed a deadly mystery for hundreds of years. Knowing your latitude could keep you from drifting onto a hostile coast, but knowing your longitude could keep you from vanishing altogether. For centuries, sailors could estimate their east to west position only loosely, and a small error at the start of a long crossing grew into an enormous danger by the end. A ship might believe itself safely far offshore, while reefs waited just ahead in the darkness. This uncertainty turned navigation into anxious guesswork, and made even the finest charts feel like promises that might break. Governments offered great rewards, scientists argued, and captains kept sailing anyway, because trade and war would not pause for an unsolved problem. The cruelest part was how the ocean punished honest mistakes. A crew could do everything right and still strike land that their reckoning said was days away. Longitude was the missing key, the one number that could turn the widest space on Earth from a trap into a road. A patient clockmaker solved longitude by keeping perfect time at sea. The answer, it turned out, lay in time itself. If you could carry the exact time of your home port while sailing far away, you could compare it with local noon and calculate how far east or west you had traveled. It sounds simple until you remember what a ship endures. Rolling decks, salt air, swinging temperatures, and constant vibration can destroy any delicate mechanism. John Harrison spent much of his life building clocks that refused to drift even as the ocean did its best to shake them apart. His marine timekeepers were more than clever machines. They were portable certainty. A captain with reliable time could plot a position that matched reality rather than hope, and that changed outcomes in a way no map alone ever could. Voyages became more direct, landfalls less accidental, and hidden reefs avoidable at last. Few objects in the whole story of the sea are as quietly dramatic as a clock that keeps its promise through a storm. Shipboard clocks helped standardize time long before radio signals existed. Before instant communication, time was a surprisingly local thing. Noon was simply the moment the sun stood highest overhead, and for most towns that was enough. Ocean travel demanded a stricter discipline, since navigators needed reliable timekeeping to compare positions and hold to a schedule across long distances. On board a ship, the clocks and chronometers became authorities that everyone obeyed, from the officer taking sightings to the crew changing watches. As voyages linked distant ports more regularly, the need for a shared sense of time grew, and shipping schedules and port operations all leaned on agreement about what the hour truly was. The day itself could feel strange on a long crossing, counted carefully yet never quite matching the calendar a sailor expected on returning home. This slow pressure to coordinate time across changing longitudes helped lay the groundwork for the standardized hours the whole world would one day keep. Medieval charts captured coastlines with a startling, practical precision. These maps, drawn for use rather than decoration, focused on coasts, harbors, and the angles between them, because that is exactly what mattered when a ship was tired and the shore was dangerous. Their dense webs of crossing lines helped a navigator hold a steady heading from one port to the next, and their careful outlines reflected knowledge gathered over countless voyages. What makes them so striking is how modern they can look in the places sailors knew well. You can feel the hand of experience in every corrected bay and every carefully placed cape. They also quietly reveal their makers' priorities, since inland regions are often vague, while the very edge of the sea is sharp and confident. For the story of exploration, these charts mark a turning point. Sea travel was becoming systematic and repeatable, and a captain no longer had to rely on memory alone. The map could carry shared knowledge forward. A ship's logbook quietly became one of the first scientific records. A log began as a simple tool of discipline, a daily account meant to keep a crew honest and a captain informed. Yet it slowly became a treasure for science. Each day demanded notes on the wind, the clouds, the state of the sea, and the ship's progress across it. Over months and years, those small entries hardened into patterns. A single captain might notice a seasonal shift, but thousands of logs across many decades revealed something far larger, showing where storms gathered, where calms lingered, and how the currents behaved from one region to the next. The log also caught the human side of a voyage in plain language, from broken masts to strange lights to the mood of the crew. Later, researchers learned to read these pages as data, even though the writers never imagined such a future. It is one of history's quiet miracles that ordinary routine could preserve the ocean's moods. The Beaufort scale finally gave the wind a shared language. Wind is difficult to describe with words alone, since people use the same terms for very different feelings. The scale changed that by linking the force of the wind to things anyone could see. Instead of vague description, a sailor could report conditions by what the wind did to the sea and to a ship's sails. That created a common language across navies and merchant fleets, and it sharpened decisions everywhere. A captain reading a forecast or an old log entry could now picture the conditions clearly, and planners could compare routes and seasons with far less confusion. The scale also made experience easier to pass on, since a new sailor could learn what a given force meant simply by watching the water behave. Over time, it became part of modern weather science, yet its roots are deeply human. It came from the need to communicate danger quickly and reliably when a misread wind could cost a life. The trade winds became great highways stretching across the oceans. In the tropics, the atmosphere sets up broad belts of wind that blow with remarkable consistency. Sailors learned that these steady winds could carry a ship westward with a speed that felt almost effortless, if only you entered the right band of latitude. Returning usually meant finding a different stream of wind, which created the great looping routes that shaped where ships could travel and where ports grew rich. Once these patterns were understood, exploration changed in character. Voyages became planned systems rather than lonely gambles, and that new efficiency fed expansion outward. Yet the same winds that carried bright ambitions also carried darker cargoes, guiding conquest, forced labor, and extraction across the sea. The trade winds are more than weather. They are part of the hidden machinery of history, a steady breath that could carry a civilization's finest hopes and its heaviest cruelties along the very same path. The doldrums could trap a ship for weeks in a maddening stillness. Near the equator lies a region of weak and shifting winds that sailors came to dread. Here the sails could hang limp for days, while the sea lay flat enough to mock the crew. Water in the barrels grew warm and foul, food spoiled, and tempers frayed as each stalled day dragged into the next. The strain was as much of the mind as the body, for a crew could see endless ocean in every direction and still feel utterly imprisoned. Then, without warning, violent squalls might erupt, tearing at the rigging as if the sky had suddenly changed its temper. Expeditions planned carefully around this zone, yet currents and bad luck often forced them in anyway. The doldrums reveal a quiet truth about the sea. Danger is not always dramatic. Sometimes the threat is stillness itself, stretching on until supplies and hope begin to thin. The Great Circle route makes the map appear to lie, yet ships arrive sooner. On a flat chart, the straight line between two ports looks obviously correct, but the Earth is a sphere, and on a sphere the shortest path is often a gentle arc. Great Circle navigation embraces that curve, sending ships along routes that can look bent or even mistaken on an ordinary map. To a new sailor, it can feel like deliberately steering away from the destination, yet the mathematics is honest, and following the true shape of the globe can shorten a crossing, save fuel, and cut days from a long voyage. This idea changed how captains planned, forcing them to trust calculation over the deceptive comfort of a straight line. It required careful steering too, since the heading must be adjusted as the route curves across the latitudes. Great Circle routes remind us that exploration is partly about learning the real shape of the world you already live upon. Great voyages carried naturalists and artists as well as sailors. As expeditions reached farther, their leaders realized that discovery was not only about arriving somewhere new, it was about returning with knowledge that could be shared. That is why many voyages made room for people who did not steer or haul on the sails. Naturalists collected specimens, sketched anatomy, and noted behavior that could never survive a long journey in a barrel. Artists recorded coastlines, tools, clothing, and ceremonies with an immediacy that words alone could not match. Interpreters made trade possible, softened misunderstandings, and sometimes saved lives by catching a threat in time. These mixed crews turned a single ship into a floating research station and a diplomatic mission at once. It created tension, since cramped quarters do not forgive differences easily, yet the reward was enormous. For a returning voyage could change libraries, museums, and ideas, not only maps. Ocean expeditions became engines of culture as much as of travel. Ocean expeditions often returned with maps and with new words for the world. When people meet unfamiliar landscapes, animals, tools, and customs, language has to stretch to hold them. Voyages brought home more than coordinates. They brought names, borrowed words, and fresh meanings for old terms. Sometimes explorers adopted a local word because their own language had no match for what they had seen. Sometimes they invented a label that stuck, even when it was clumsy or mistaken. These words entered common speech through journals, through trade, and through conversation in the crowded port cities where cultures mixed daily. The process shaped how distant places were imagined by people who would never travel there. A name can carry wonder or misunderstanding or power, and it can shape attitudes for generations. This is why vocabulary matters in the history of exploration. Language is never neutral packaging. A coastline mapped and named becomes easier to discuss, easier to claim, and easier to turn into legend. Early expedition sketches served as biology textbooks for scientists who never left home. Before photographs could travel easily, a careful drawing could be the difference between real knowledge and mere rumor. Artists aboard ships sketched fish, birds, shells, and sea plants with an urgency that mixed wonder and responsibility. A scholar back home might never see a living coral or a strange deep water catch, yet a good drawing could preserve its shape, proportion, and key features well enough for study. These images became a kind of portable fieldwork, passed between libraries and lecture halls as evidence gathered from faraway water. The finest expedition artists learned to capture detail without turning animals into fantasy, and they worked quickly, since specimens decayed and colors faded fast. Their sketches also preserved context, showing where a creature was found or how life clustered along a reef. This is how the ocean entered scholarship for people who never left the shore, as pencil lines that became stepping stones across the distance. Magellan's expedition proved the Earth could be circled by sea alone. When the voyage set out, it carried a daring idea that a ship might reach the very point it had left without ever touching land routes along the way. The journey became a grinding trial of storms, shortages, and tension that turned crewmates into rivals. Magellan himself did not live to see the outcome, falling far from home, yet one battered vessel eventually completed the enormous loop. The return was no triumphant parade. It was proof carved out of sheer endurance. A voyage all the way around the world forced sailors to confront how vast the planet truly felt from the deck, where every day was measured by wind and water. It also revealed a practical truth, that the oceans connect into one continuous system with passages that can be found and used, if only a crew can survive long enough to search. The world felt larger in hardship and smaller in possibility all at once. Captain Cook charted coasts so carefully that sailors used his maps for generations. Precision at sea is far more than pride. It is often the difference between life and death. James Cook earned a reputation for mapping coastlines with a care that outlasted his own era. He took repeated bearings, checked his position whenever the skies allowed, and treated every error as a debt to be repaid before moving on. The result was a set of charts that helped later crews avoid reefs, find safe anchorages, and enter unfamiliar harbors with far fewer surprises. His work mattered because the Pacific is unforgiving, where islands can be small and a single misjudged mile can turn into a long, desperate drift. Yet accurate mapping also reshaped power, since a coast that is measured and named becomes easier to claim and to control. Cook's charts sit at a tense crossroads. They represent extraordinary skill and patient observation, and they also became tools that opened distant lands to conquest. The voyage of the Beagle quietly reshaped how we understand life. The ship set out to survey coastlines, but it also carried a young naturalist with a restless notebook. During years at sea and ashore, Charles Darwin compared creatures and landscapes across enormous distances, and he began to see patterns that felt too consistent to be mere chance. Similar animals appeared on different islands with small telling differences, as if shaped by the conditions around them. Fossils hinted that past worlds had held different forms of life, and living species seemed connected in ways people had not fully accepted. The voyage did not hand him a finished theory. It gave him questions that would not let go, and long empty stretches at sea in which to turn them over. When his later ideas finally reached the public, they challenged how humanity understood nature and its own place within it. A journey meant to map coastlines ended up mapping an entirely new way of thinking. The Challenger expedition founded modern ocean science in a single journey. In the later 19th century, this ship set out on a mission that sounds almost impossible: to measure the ocean, sample it, and describe it systematically all around the globe. The crew lowered lines to take the depth, hauled up sediment from the bottom, and collected water from different layers of the sea. They gathered creatures from places no human had ever visited, then shipped them home to be studied in careful detail. The work was slow and relentless, since every station demanded patience and coordination, often in rough weather. What made the voyage revolutionary was its intent. It treated the sea as something that could be investigated with consistent methods, rather than scattered anecdotes. Its results filled great volumes and shaped the very language of oceanography. After that journey, the ocean was no longer only a route to somewhere else. It became a subject worth exploring for its own sake. The first deep soundings revealed an ocean far deeper than anyone imagined. For a long time, many people pictured the seafloor as a nearby bottom, something a strong rope could reach without much trouble. The first true deep soundings shattered that comfort. Crews lowered weighted lines until the cord vanished into darkness, and the waiting stretched on long enough to feel unreal. When the line finally came back, it carried a number that made sailors and scholars stare at one another. The ocean was not a shallow basin at all. It was a vast vertical world. That discovery changed everything, from where ships could safely anchor to whether anyone could ever reach the deepest places. It also stirred the imagination, for a sea with such depth might hide landscapes of mountains and valleys, and life shaped by pressures no human body could endure. A simple act, Dropping a line straight down had opened a whole new dimension of the planet. Whaling voyages mapped much of the world at a terrible cost. Whalers pursued animals that ranged across enormous distances, so their work carried ships into remote seas long before many scientific expeditions arrived. Captains recorded routes, currents, and landmarks with great care, because success depended on finding the whales again and again. Over time, that practical record built a rough map of the world, one shaped entirely by pursuit and profit. Yet the knowledge came with a devastating price. Whale populations were struck hard, and some species were pushed toward collapse as the demand grew for oil and other products. These voyages also transformed coastal towns, building fortunes even as the living resource that supported them dwindled away. The history is uncomfortable, and it should be. Ocean expeditions have often mixed curiosity with extraction, and whaling is a vivid example. It expanded human reach into distant waters, and it proved that the ocean's abundance was never truly endless. The Manila galleons stitched Asia and the Americas into one ocean route. Imagine a single sailing line that carried silver one way and silk, porcelain, and spices the other, year after year across the widest ocean on Earth. For centuries, these galleons did exactly that, linking the Philippines and the Americas in a circuit that helped build an early form of global trade. The crossing was long and punishing. Ships had to time their departures, ration their water, and survive storms that could shred the rigging like paper, while crews faced an isolation that tested morale as much as skill. Yet the reward was enormous. A successful voyage could reshape markets, fund governments, and fill distant cities with goods that felt almost magical to people who had never seen them. Ports became melting pots where languages, foods, and customs mixed under the pressure of profit and distance. This was more than trade. It was a dependable ocean bridge, proving the vast Pacific could be crossed on schedule. The Atlantic slave trade turned sea routes into machinery for suffering. This was not a story of brave discovery. It was a system of violence that bent the ocean to the purpose of human cruelty. People were captured and forced onto ships, then carried across the Atlantic under conditions designed for profit rather than survival. The crossings stripped away names, families, and futures, and it fed distant plantations and empires with stolen labor. Some ships became floating prisons where illness spread quickly and despair was constant, and resistance took many forms, from refusal to eat to open revolt against impossible odds. The legacy did not end at any shoreline. It shaped economies, laws, and identities across whole continents, and it left wounds that still matter deeply today. When we speak of the history of the sea, this crossing must be faced honestly. The same ocean that carried ideas and goods also carried suffering at an industrial scale, and remembering that is part of justice. Piracy followed the shipping lanes like a patient shadow. Where wealth travels in predictable paths, predators soon appear. As trade routes hardened into habit, pirates learned to wait exactly where ships had to pass, near narrow straits, busy approaches, and clustered islands. Their success depended on speed, intimidation, and a careful knowledge of tides and local geography. Merchant crews often had little chance, since an attack could strip a ship of its cargo, seize the vessel itself, or hold lives for ransom, all within minutes. The response changed the history of the sea. Nations began to fund stronger patrols, build better armed escorts, and gather ships into protected convoys. Insurance markets grew, ports tightened their rules, and even ship design shifted toward faster vessels that could flee trouble. Piracy also gathered its own mythology, but the reality was more practical and more frightening. It was organized crime upon the water, feeding on the very connections that made great cities rich. Privateers blurred the line between war and business. A privateer could look much like an ordinary merchant captain, until the moment when profit and patriotism happened to align. Governments issued legal commissions that allowed privately owned ships to attack an enemy's commerce, seize cargo, and sell their prizes while sharing the proceeds with crews and backers. This turned conflict into a kind of business model. A bold voyage could make a fortune, and it could also weaken a rival without a single formal battle. The line between lawful capture and outright piracy was thin in practice, and an argument over paperwork could decide whether a man was celebrated or hanged. For ordinary expeditions, the effect was chilling, since trade routes became contested zones where even neutral ships might be harassed. Privateering shaped strategy because it struck at the lifeblood of empires, which was shipping. It also created careers for daring sailors who learned to navigate not only oceans, but laws and shifting loyalties. Mutinies turned voyages into rebellions when leadership failed. A ship is a small, sealed world with no easy exit. When food runs low, when pay feels uncertain, or when discipline turns cruel, resentment has nowhere to drain away. It builds with every watch and every harsh order. A mutiny can begin quietly, with whispered agreements and shared anger, then explode in the moment when the crew decides that fear is no longer a reason to obey. Some mutinies were desperate attempts to survive bad command, others were power grabs fueled by grievance and ambition. Either way, they reveal the fragile agreement that keeps an expedition moving at all. A captain holds authority, but the sea holds everyone. If the crew stops believing the voyage is worth the risk, a mission can collapse overnight. The aftermath could be grim, ending in trials or exile. Yet mutinies also forced navies and companies to confront the real conditions endured aboard their ships. Scurvy killed more sailors than storms or cannon fire ever did. On long voyages, crews began to fail in a strange and terrifying way. Gums swelled and bled, old wounds reopened, legs grew weak, and simple work became agony. A ship could leave port with a strong crew and arrive with ghosts. The tragedy is that scurvy was no curse or monster. It was a slow nutritional collapse, driven by months without fresh sources of what we now call vitamin C. For a long time, expeditions met it with superstition, resignation, or useless remedies, while the sea kept quietly collecting bodies. When effective prevention finally spread, it changed far more than health. It changed strategy itself. A nation that could keep its crews alive, could sail farther, stay out longer, and return more reliably. The ocean did not become kinder. Humans simply became better prepared, and a little fruit, carried and rationed with care, helped turn slow attrition into sustained exploration. A simple fruit quietly changed the reach of every navy. For centuries, the cause of scurvy remained hidden, and commanders treated the sickness as an unavoidable price of long voyages. Then careful observation began to reveal that certain foods could keep it at bay, and fresh citrus in particular seemed to hold the disease back. It was not a single miracle meal, but a growing understanding that health could be managed through steady habit. Captains who insisted on the right provisions found that their crews stayed strong across months at sea, while others still watched their men waste away. The lesson reached beyond medicine into the heart of strategy. When sailors stopped dying in predictable waves, the map of what was possible suddenly expanded. Longer crossings, farther reaches, and more reliable returns all became achievable. It is a striking reminder that great journeys are often won in storerooms and galleys, in the unglamorous care of the body. As much as on the open deck, sailors sang to work together and to carry the news between ports. On a sailing ship, many tasks demanded perfect timing. Hauling a heavy line, raising a yard, or turning a capstan all went better when bodies moved as one rather than in scattered effort. Sea shanties were work tools built from rhythm. A leader would call, the crew would answer, and the shared pulse kept everyone pulling at the same moment. That coordination reduced injury and increased the work a tired crew could do, which is exactly why the songs spread. They also carried culture, since verses changed with the ports and the events a crew had seen. A single song could become a kind of moving bulletin board, carrying gossip, grief, and humor from harbor to harbor. In a world where news traveled slowly, sailors often arrived with stories before any letter did. The shanty is a reminder that the history of the sea lives in muscles and voices, not only in documents. Shipwrecks became time capsules resting quietly on the seafloor. When a ship goes down, it carries its own moment with it. Tools, ceramics, coins, personal letters, and countless ordinary objects that rarely survive on land can all be sealed together by cold, salt, and darkness. Over time, currents slowly bury and reveal these fragments like a page turning across centuries. From a scattered cargo, archaeologists can read old trade patterns, and from the way the timbers broke apart, they can reconstruct the fury of a storm. Sometimes the sea preserves astonishing detail, since wooden hulls can last where oxygen is scarce, and sealed containers can protect delicate goods for hundreds of years. Yet a wreck is not a treasure chest from a story, it is often a grave, and it asks for respect. It also raises hard questions of ownership. Each dive to such a place quietly asks whether we are learning or simply taking. Salvage divers chasing treasure accidentally advanced the science of diving itself. Salvage began as a race against time and water. Cargo was valuable, and a storm or shifting sand could hide it forever. So divers went down with simple gear, poor visibility, and enormous risk, often working by touch alone. Pressure squeezed their lungs, dissolved gases clouded their minds, and a small equipment failure could turn a plan into tragedy in seconds. To survive, crews improvised. They refined air pumps, improved hoses, and developed better helmets and valves, learning hard lessons about how a body must rise slowly from the deep. Innovation followed danger like a shadow. What began as a hunt for coins and cannon often produced techniques that later supported science, construction, and rescue. Salvage also changed how people imagined the underwater world. The seafloor stopped being a place only fish could visit and became a workplace, and later a frontier for research, where greed and curiosity strangely traveled together. Lighthouses grew into great networks because a single hidden reef could ruin a fleet. Before modern navigation aids, a coastline could be a trap that waited in silence, its reefs and shifting sandbars invisible until the surf broke or the wood cracked. Lighthouses became the answer to that fear, and not as lonely single towers, but as networks designed to guide ships through dangerous approaches and mark hazards with recognizable patterns of light. Each beacon was a kind of promise, telling sailors there was a fixed point in a world that moved. Building them was difficult and often dangerous, since some rose on wave-battered rocks where the crews fought the weather as much as the engineering. Their impact reached beyond mere safety, for reliable navigation improved trade, lowered insurance, and helped ports grow. A lighthouse also touched the heart of a returning voyage, when a familiar light could be the first sign of home after months away upon the water. Quarantine stations were born where ships first met the shore. Ports were gateways, and that made them vulnerable, since a ship could bring not only cargo and wealth, but also illness that might spread through crowded streets faster than any sailor could describe it. Quarantine stations emerged as a kind of defensive infrastructure. Ships were held offshore, passengers inspected, and goods aired, washed, or destroyed, all based on slowly evolving ideas about contagion. Even when people lacked modern explanations, they could see the pattern plainly, that outbreaks followed arrivals, and that isolation reduced the spread. These stations were often tense places, full of uncertainty and fear, and the constant conflict between public safety and commerce. They also created early versions of public health, forcing societies to decide who could detain a ship and for how long. Ocean travel connected bodies as well as maps, and every new route could carry unseen passengers along with its treasures. To name a coastline was often the first step toward claiming it. In many eras, arriving first was treated almost like ownership. Crews would land, raise a flag, read a declaration, and record the act in a logbook as if the ocean had delivered empty space, simply waiting to be taken. The reality was usually far more complicated. Some coasts were already inhabited, and the claim ignored the lives already there. Others were empty yet still mattered, offering fresh water, safe anchorage, or a future base for trade and communication. Over time, these marks on the map became points of argument, pulled into rival charts, treaties, and disputes. A small stretch of shore could gain enormous value as technology changed, becoming important for cables, coaling, or the reach of an empire. This is why ocean expeditions are tied so closely to politics, as well as curiosity. The quiet moment of naming a coast could echo for generations. The search for a northwest passage drove centuries of Arctic suffering. For generations, European powers chased the dream of a shortcut across the top of North America, a sea route that would bypass long voyages and hostile rivals and promise enormous profit. So ships pushed into ice-choked waters with hopes that often outweighed their preparation. The Arctic answered with darkness, crushing pressure, and a cold that turned the simplest task into exhausting labor. Crews fought scurvy, frostbite, and hunger while the ice decided whether they moved at all. A ship could be trapped for an entire season, and the long waiting could break a crew's spirit as surely as any storm breaks a mast. The expeditions kept coming because the reward felt like a key to the trade of the world. Many returned with little more than hard lessons, and many did not return at all. The passage was a reminder that exploration is not always heroic. Sometimes it is a long series of losses. Franklin's lost expedition became a haunting warning about pride. When Sir John Franklin sailed into the Arctic, the venture carried confidence, prestige, and the belief that modern organization could conquer an ancient obstacle. 2 ships, trained crews, and supplies meant to last for years were supposed to turn a daunting route into a manageable plan. Then the ice closed in, and the plans stopped mattering. The expedition vanished into a landscape that does not forgive delay, and the years that followed became a grim mystery for families and governments alike. Search parties later found traces that suggested hunger, cold, and desperate choices as conditions grew worse and worse. What makes the story so chilling is how ordinary the beginning looked. Orders were issued, decks were scrubbed, and optimism held steady right until the environment changed the rules entirely. The loss became a lasting warning that technology and rank do not guarantee safety, and that in the Arctic, humility is a survival tool. Inuit knowledge saved lives where European maps proved useless. In the far north, local expertise was never an extra. It was the difference between living and disappearing. Inuit communities understood sea ice as a shifting terrain with safe paths, dangerous pressure ridges, and seasonal rhythms that outsiders often misread completely. They knew how to travel when visibility vanished, how to find food where a stranger saw only white, and how to read subtle signs that arrived before a storm. Their tools and clothing were shaped by the environment, built from materials proven across countless generations. When European expeditions struggled and starved, Inuit guidance could mean better routes, better shelter, and better decisions. Yet this knowledge was often dismissed or undervalued, even as it kept people alive. It is one of the sharpest lessons in the whole history of exploration. The most advanced map can still fail if it is not grounded in lived experience. Listening, respect, and partnership matter as much as any instrument. Sea ice charts saved ships and slowly became early climate archives. In polar waters, ice is not background scenery, but a moving hazard that can trap, crush, or block a route entirely. Explorers began recording the edges of the ice, the open leads between the floes, and the timing of freeze and thaw, because a single wrong assumption could end a voyage. These charts were practical tools, shared between captains who understood that memory alone was not enough. Yet over years and decades, the records quietly became something more. They formed an unintended archive of changing conditions, and when later researchers compared old charts with new observations, they could see shifts in the timing and reach of the ice that hinted at far broader patterns. What began as a survival document became evidence. It is a familiar theme in the story of the sea. People write down what they must, and future generations read those notes as more than mere logistics. The Southern Ocean humbled nearly every ship that dared to cross it. This vast band of water circling Antarctica earned its fearsome reputation the hard way. Winds can rise without warning, waves can build into moving walls, and the cold water punishes mistakes with frightening speed. Early ships that tried these latitudes met seas that felt almost alive, rising and breaking with a force that made the rigging scream and the timbers groan. Navigation grew harder as storms blocked the sightings of sun and stars for long stretches, and drifting ice added danger whenever visibility failed. Crews were soaked, exhausted, and forever repairing, often while trying to sleep in a world that never stopped moving. The lesson of those early crossings was simple and stern. Skill matters, but conditions can still overwhelm skill. When a vessel finally cleared those waters, the feeling was not pride but gratitude, and a deep new respect for a place that owed no mercy to anyone. Antarctic expeditions proved that endurance could outlast even careful planning. The far south was explored in an age of stronger ships and growing scientific confidence, yet it still demanded a stubborn resilience that no blueprint could fully provide. Crews entered a continent of wind, glare, and isolation, where the cold was not just a temperature, but a constant pressure on every decision. Equipment failed, fuel ran low, and weather could erase days of progress in an instant. Even well-supplied parties faced the sheer problem of distance, since every mile of gear had to be hauled across the ice, often against the wind. What kept many expeditions alive was not flawless strategy, but the ability to adapt when plans cracked apart. Teams learned to repair what they had, ration what they feared to lose, and keep moving even when the landscape offered no reward. Antarctic history shows again and again that exploration is as much about persisting as it is about arriving. The whole world watched as Shackleton brought every man home from the ice. When his ship became trapped and then slowly crushed by the pack, an ambitious expedition turned into a desperate fight to keep every person alive. What followed was leadership at its most practical. He kept his crew focused on routines, on morale, and on the next achievable step, even when the horizon offered no comfort at all. They camped on drifting ice, then took to small boats across some of the most dangerous seas on Earth, aiming for the faint hope of land and help. The odds were brutal, with freezing spray, exhaustion, and the constant risk of capsizing. In the end, Shackleton pushed on with a small party to seek rescue, then returned for the others. The story is famous because it refuses the usual shape of triumph or tragedy. The central victory was not a new coast or a scientific prize. It was simply that everyone came home. Nansen let the ice itself carry his ship across the Arctic. Fridtjof Nansen proposed an idea that sounded almost like surrender. Instead of fighting the Arctic pack, he would let it carry his vessel wherever it drifted. His ship was built to survive the crushing pressure by being shaped to rise as the ice squeezed against it, and then the crew deliberately froze it into the pack. Months stretched into years as the ship drifted with currents that were poorly understood, proving that the ice itself could become a slow-moving platform. This was not idle waiting. It was disciplined observation, careful rationing, and constant readiness for sudden change. The experiment tested a bold theory about how Arctic waters flowed, and it tested human patience just as severely, for the crew traveled great distances while the scenery barely changed. Nansen's voyage shows a different kind of exploration. Sometimes the wisest way forward is not to force your own motion, but to cooperate with the movement of the world itself. The Trieste reached the deepest point on Earth and returned safely. In the early 1960s, this remarkable vessel carried 2 men into the deepest known part of the ocean. The descent took hours, and the light fell away until the world beyond the small window was utterly black. The pressure climbed to a level that would crush ordinary structures, so the crew depended on a strong sphere and careful engineering to survive. Along the way, the craft passed through layers of different temperature and density, each one a boundary between worlds. At the very bottom, the seafloor was not a dramatic cliff, but a quiet expanse of pale sediment, stirred by the slightest movement. The true achievement was not only reaching that depth, it was coming back. The return proved that humans could visit the deepest trench on the planet and survive the journey. That single dive became a symbol of what exploration can do when curiosity meets patient craftsmanship. The bathysphere let people watch the deep with their own eyes. Picture a small steel ball hanging beneath a ship on a single cable, lowering slowly into darkness while the surface shrinks to a coin of light. The bathysphere was exactly that, a tiny chamber with thick walls, small windows, and no ability to move on its own. It was not a submarine in any heroic sense. It was a controlled drop into a pressure that could crush weaker metal. What made it revolutionary was the direct presence of human eyes at depth. Observers could look out and describe what they saw in real time, rather than examining a specimen hauled up, crushed, and dead. They reported strange lights, drifting animals, and the eerie feeling of hanging in an alien column of water. The bathysphere proved that descent was possible with careful engineering and steady nerve. It also reframed exploration itself, showing a new world waiting straight down beneath the hull. Early diving suits made the seabed reachable, if painfully clumsy. The first heavy diving suits turned a human being into a walking experiment. A hard helmet, weighted boots, and air pumped down from above allowed a diver to work below the surface far longer than any breath could permit. Pressure that would otherwise squeeze the lungs became manageable, and tasks like inspection, repair, and salvage moved into a new realm. Yet mobility was the price paid for that access. Divers shuffled rather than swam, and every step risked snagging a line or sinking into mud. Communication was limited, and a simple problem like a twisted hose or a stuck valve could become a life-threatening emergency in moments. Visibility was often poor, so much of the work was done by touch, by patience, and by trust in the crew above. These suits did not make the sea friendly. They made it reachable, and they turned the seabed into a place humans could visit on purpose. Roman grain fleets fed a great city and could topple an empire. A powerful city can be brought low without an army if its food simply stops arriving. Roman power depended on enormous shipments of grain crossing open water, especially when local harvests could not meet the demand. These ships became floating lifelines. When the seas were calm, the whole system looked unstoppable. But when the weather turned, it revealed itself as frighteningly fragile. A delayed convoy could mean hunger, unrest, and a political crisis that spread faster than any rumor. This is one reason Rome invested so heavily in ports, warehouses, and naval protection, and why its captains studied the seasonal patterns of wind and storm with almost religious seriousness. The sea was both a road and a threat, able to deliver abundance one month and erase it the next. These voyages were not always about discovery. They were about keeping daily life alive on an imperial scale. The transition from sail to steam rewrote what distance meant at sea. Sailing ships depended on wind and weather, which meant that travel time often felt like a negotiation with the sky. Steam changed that relationship entirely. With engines, a ship could move even when the air refused to cooperate, and routes became far more predictable. That new predictability altered everything, from passenger travel to naval strategy to the planning of scientific work. It also changed the ports themselves, since steamships needed fuel, repairs, and specialized infrastructure, so networks of coaling stations and service hubs suddenly gained importance. At the same time, the old romance of sail gave way to the grind of machinery, heat, and constant maintenance. A voyage became less about waiting for the right breeze, and more about managing an industrial system at sea. The real shift was psychological. Distance began to feel like something you could plan for, rather than simply endure. Naval battles pushed ship design forward, and science quietly borrowed the improvements. War at sea is a brutal laboratory. When survival depends on speed, stability, and endurance, navies invest in better hulls, stronger materials, and more reliable steering. Battles exposed weaknesses quickly, since a ship that handled poorly in heavy seas could lose before a single gun was fired. Those hard-won innovations did not stay confined to conflict. Explorers and scientists later inherited sturdier vessels, improved navigation rooms, and better ways to store fragile instruments, because the very traits that helped in battle also helped in storms and on long voyages. Stronger ships could carry heavier equipment, survive rougher weather, and stay at sea far longer without falling apart. In this way, military pressure quietly widened the frontier of research. It is a complicated inheritance, for the ocean's finest tools were sometimes forged for violence and only later turned toward discovery. Coaling stations quietly decided which empires could roam the seas. Steam power promised freedom from the wind, yet it chained ships to their fuel instead. A navy or a trading company could only project its strength as far as its next reliable supply of coal. So distant ports became strategic prizes, and a small harbor with good storage could suddenly matter more than a rich inland city, because it kept the engines running and the schedules intact. Rival powers competed for these points on the map, negotiating leases, building depots, and sometimes seizing territory outright to secure a single refueling stop. A ship that arrived to find an empty bunker was not merely delayed, it was stranded and vulnerable, caught between oceans and politics. Coaling itself was exhausting work, full of dust, heat, and tight timing that could turn a quiet port call into a frenzy. These humble stations shaped the shipping routes of the world like beads strung along a line. The opening of the Suez Canal bent the map of the entire world. When the canal opened, it cut a doorway between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and the pattern of sea travel suddenly folded around it. Voyages that once swung far around the southern tip of Africa could now be planned along a shorter spine through Egypt. That shift did more than save time. It changed which ports thrived, which fleets could respond quickly, and which regions became urgent to control. Expedition planning grew less seasonal on some routes, since ships no longer had to gamble on the long haul around the Cape. Yet the canal also concentrated vulnerability, for a narrow passage can become a pressure point where a blockade or an accident ripples outward into global trade. For explorers, it meant faster reach into the Indian Ocean and beyond. For empires, it meant that strategy now had a choke point, and choke points attract conflict and ambition. The Panama Canal joined two oceans and changed strategy overnight. Before the canal, moving a ship between the Atlantic and the Pacific could mean a punishing voyage around the stormy southern tip of South America, where winds and seas tested every plank and every exhausted crew. The canal turned that ordeal into a controlled passage through a chain of locks and lakes. Naval strategy shifted almost immediately, as fleets could be redeployed far more quickly, and shipping companies could design routes with new efficiency. Ports on both coasts gained fresh importance, while older waypoints faded. Expeditions changed shape too, since a research vessel could plan work across multiple oceans without committing long months to rounding the far south. Yet the canal came with its own drama, for engineers had to tame tropical disease, heavy rains, and unstable ground. A single man-made corridor now connected two immense basins, and the ocean world grew more tightly woven, its balance of power tightening around one narrow hinge. Undersea cables turned the oceans into corridors for messages. Before these cables were laid, news crossed the sea only at the speed of a ship, so a war could end before a distant capital even heard that it had begun. Submarine telegraph cables changed that relationship with time entirely. Messages could suddenly travel in minutes, which transformed diplomacy, finance, and journalism. Markets could react quickly, governments could coordinate across continents, and families could receive short words that once would have taken months to arrive. The engineering challenge was immense. Cables had to survive salt water, crushing pressure, abrasion, and the constant motion of currents, while their insulation resisted decay, and the whole line was laid without snapping under its own weight. Failures were common, and each one taught painful lessons about materials and the shape of the seafloor. When a working line finally held, the ocean did not shrink physically, yet it shrank emotionally, becoming a pathway for thought as well as for ships. Cable-laying ships mapped the seafloor long before sonar existed. To lay a cable safely, you must know what lies beneath you, since steep drops, sharp ridges, and rough ground can grind a line until it fails. Long before modern sound imaging, cable crews built their knowledge from soundings, tension readings, and careful attention to how a cable behaved as it unspooled into the deep. Every time the line snagged, scraped, or suddenly went slack, it hinted at the shape of the unseen floor below. Over many projects, those hints gathered into a rough portrait of underwater geography, with valleys, plateaus, and unexpected mountains slowly emerging in the minds of engineers and navigators. This work was not glamorous, Yet it was quietly revolutionary. It turned the abyss from a blank on the map into a landscape with real features and hazards. The goal was communication, but the lasting side effect was discovery, written mile by careful mile. Storm forecasting began with sailors comparing notes across oceans. Long before satellites watched from above, mariners treated the sky as a living document, reading cloud shapes, pressure changes, and shifts in the wind. A single captain might recognize the approach of danger, but true forecasting required a shared memory larger than any one voyage. Over time, sailors began comparing observations gathered from different regions and different seasons, and patterns started to appear. Certain wind directions came before certain seas. A sudden calm could be a warning rather than a gift, and a steadily falling pressure could mean trouble even under a clear sky. Ports, navies, and later scientists began collecting these reports and building the first charts of storms and seasonal behavior. This changed how expeditions were planned, letting captains choose safer windows and take warnings more seriously than superstition. Forecasting never removed the risk, but it gave ships a fighting chance and revealed that the ocean teaches patiently to those who share what they learn. The first global weather charts were stitched together from ship's logs. Long before computers, a broad view of the world's weather had to be assembled by hand from countless local observations. Ship logs recorded winds, pressure, cloud cover, and storms in places where no land station could ever exist. When these scattered records were gathered and compared, patterns began to emerge across whole oceans and seasons. Scientists could trace prevailing wind belts, common storm tracks, and regions of frequent calm, and that knowledge improved route planning and reduced danger, since captains could anticipate the kinds of weather they might meet. The making of these charts also marks a quiet shift in thinking. Individual experiences became a shared dataset, so that a storm which terrified one crew became a single point on a map that might help another crew avoid the same fate. These early charts are evidence of collective learning, where the ocean taught, ships recorded, and society slowly learned to read the sky. Tide tables turned the sea's daily rise into a dependable schedule. Tides look simple until you try to predict them in an unfamiliar port with a reef at the entrance and only a narrow window of safety. Early tide tables were built from relentless observation, with people recording the height of the water day after day through storm and calm. Those long records revealed cycles that could finally be trusted, turning coastal navigation into something closer to a timetable than a gamble. A captain could plan an arrival for high water, avoid grounding, and time a departure to catch a helpful current. Tides mattered for exploration landings too, since a boat that reached shore at the wrong moment could be stranded, smashed, or unable to return to its ship. By gathering long records across many places, scientists and mariners began to see the tides as one great system, moved by the moon, the sun, and the shape of the coast. The tables were quiet triumphs of patience. Ocean currents were first measured with humble drifting bottles. Long before satellites and electronic sensors, oceanographers used the simplest of objects to ask a vast question: where does the water go? They sealed messages inside bottles or released marked floats, then waited for a stranger on some distant shore to report where the sea had carried them. Each returned message was a single data point delivered by chance and patience. Over time, patterns emerged that hinted at great highways of moving water, the loops and boundary currents that could speed a voyage or quietly sabotage it. Later, purpose-built drifters made the method more reliable, able to transmit their positions and reveal currents invisible from a ship's deck. The romance of a bottled note gave way to steady tracking, yet the core idea stayed the same. Let the ocean carry something for you, then read the story written in its path. The sea's hidden motion was becoming measurable at last. Sonar turned the dark ocean into echoes and distance. In fog, in darkness, or in deep water, human sight fails quickly. Sonar offered a different sense, one built entirely on sound. A pulse goes out, a reflection returns, and the time between becomes a measuring stick for distance. That simple idea transformed both travel and exploration. Submerged hazards could be detected, depths could be mapped, and objects could be located in places where a line and wait would take far too long. Sonar also changed how people pictured the seafloor. Instead of an abstract unknown, it became a surface with slopes, peaks, and trenches that could be traced in sweeping passes across the water. For expedition crews, this meant new confidence and new responsibility, since the ability to see with sound made it possible to plan with real precision and to attempt projects that once felt impossible. Sonar did not remove the ocean's power. It simply gave humans a way to listen. Depth charges forced a new understanding of the sea in wartime. When submarines turned invisibility into a weapon, the ocean stopped being only a surface battlefield, and navies scrambled to answer a threat they could not easily see. Depth charges were a blunt reply. Explosive barrels dropped into suspected positions and set to detonate at chosen depths. Each attack became an experiment in sound, timing, and pressure. Crews listened for propellers, watched for oil, and tried to imagine a target moving in 3 dimensions beneath them. A charge did not need a direct hit to be devastating, for the shock waves could crack a hull or force a submarine to the surface in panic. This pressure drove rapid innovation in listening gear, tactics, and coordination between ships. It also changed how people studied the sea, since suddenly the temperature layers and hidden acoustics of the water mattered to survival. Wartime urgency pushed ocean knowledge forward at a frightening cost. Convoys crossed the Atlantic, and statistics quietly became a survival tool. When submarines hunted merchant ships, the Atlantic became a grim numbers game with human stakes. Sailing alone meant a ship could vanish without a single witness, so vessels were gathered into convoys under escort, turning scattered targets into a defended formation. The decision was not only emotional, but mathematical. Planners measured loss rates, route choices, escort coverage, and the probability of an encounter, and small improvements in timing or spacing could save hundreds of lives and vast tonnage of cargo. Weather reports, intercepted signals, and patrol patterns all fed into constant recalculation. Even the zigzag path of a ship was debated as a trade between safety and fuel. This was a new kind of ocean expedition, a moving city of steel and worry crossing dark water while an enemy might be listening below. In that setting, statistics were not cold abstraction, they were hope expressed in careful planning. The Titanic disaster rewrote the rules of ocean travel. When the great ships sank, it was not only a vessel that went down, but a belief, the confidence that size and prestige could somehow outrun the sea. The shock exposed painful gaps in the culture of safety. Lifeboat capacity, radio watch practices, and emergency drills were suddenly seen as matters of life and death rather than optional extras. In the aftermath, governments and shipping companies moved towards stricter standards, including constant distress monitoring and better requirements for life-saving equipment. Routes through icy waters were reconsidered, and ice reporting became more formal. What makes the tragedy so lasting is its mix of grandeur and vulnerability, a marvel of engineering brought down by ordinary hazards of cold water, darkness, and human delay. Ocean travel became safer because the world finally paid attention, and because rules were written in response to a single night of irreversible loss. The wreck of the Titanic was found alive with strange, quiet life. Decades after the ship sank, locating it required deep ocean technology, careful mapping, and patient searching across a vast stretch of seafloor. When explorers at last reached the wreck, the surprise was not only emotional but biological. The site was alive. The aqualung let ordinary people breathe beneath the waves. For a long time, diving meant heavy suits, air hoses trailing to the surface, and a narrow range of movement. The aqualung changed all of that by placing the breathing supply directly on the diver, freeing people to swim wherever they chose. Suddenly exploration could be nimble. A diver could follow a reef wall, circle a wreck, or linger quietly to watch an animal's behavior, no longer tethered to a boat by a long lifeline. That freedom created new kinds of work and new kinds of play, and it also brought new responsibility, since depth and time underwater carry real danger. Training, buddy systems, and careful planning became part of the culture, yet the transformation was profound. Underwater archaeology grew more practical. Marine biology gained direct observation in natural settings, and photography beneath the surface became possible. The aqualung did not conquer the ocean, but it invited far more people to visit it. The first undersea habitats tested whether humans could truly live below. Living underwater is not the same as merely visiting, and these sealed habitats were built to answer a bold question: could people stay beneath the surface for long stretches and still work effectively? Inside their pressurized spaces, teams slept, ate, and planned dives while the weight of the ocean pressed in and the surface felt impossibly far away. A technique that kept the body under steady pressure made repeated excursions possible without constant, lengthy decompression. Though returning fully to the surface still required time and care, the habitats became laboratories for physiology, engineering, and psychology alike. How does isolation feel when you can see sunlight through water but cannot touch the open air? How do teamwork and fatigue change when every exit demands a plan? These projects advanced tools and life support, and they showed that exploration can become a way of living, with routines and anxieties much like a space mission. Cold War submarines gathered ocean secrets in near silence. During those tense decades, submarines were built for secrecy, deterrence, and surveillance, yet their missions often produced unexpected knowledge about the ocean itself. To navigate safely and remain hidden, crews needed detailed information about the shape of the seafloor, the layering of temperature, and the way sound traveled through different masses of water. This pushed systematic mapping and careful measurement in places far from any shipping lane. Much of the data was classified, so the wider scientific world did not benefit at once, but the work still advanced a practical understanding of underwater geography and acoustics. Submarines also traveled beneath the ice and through deep basins that surface ships found nearly impossible to study. The ocean became an arena where politics demanded precision, and precision demanded observation. It is a strange chapter in the story of exploration, where curiosity was never the stated goal, yet discovery happened anyway. Nuclear power let submarines stay under longer than some wars lasted. Older submarines had to surface or snorkel regularly, which meant exposure, vulnerability, and hard limits on endurance. Nuclear propulsion changed the rules by allowing a vessel to remain submerged for very long periods, bounded mainly by food, maintenance, and the stamina of the crew. This created a new kind of ocean presence. A submarine could cross whole basins without ever revealing itself, operate beneath the ice, and maintain patrols far longer than earlier technology allowed. For the story of exploration, the importance was as much psychological as technical, since the ocean became a continuous operating environment, rather than a place visited briefly from the surface. Underwater navigation, life support, and daily routine all had to be refined, because the ship was now a sealed world for months at a time. This capability also deepened human knowledge of currents, sound channels, and hidden obstacles across the deep. The first map of the whole seafloor revealed a hidden mountain range. For centuries, maps treated the deep ocean as blank because no one could see it. As soundings and later sonar surveys slowly accumulated, a startling pattern emerged from the numbers. A long chain of mountains ran through the world's oceans, linking the basins like a great seam across the planet. This was the mid-ocean ridge system, a global feature that almost no one had imagined could exist. Seeing it on a map changed the story of the Earth itself. The seafloor was not static and flat. It had structure, continuity, and clues about the processes stirring beneath it. Mapping also revealed deep trenches, fracture zones, and broad plains, turning the ocean into a landscape with recognizable shapes rather than pure mystery. Creating that map took patience and collaboration, drawing on many voyages and many instruments, and a willingness to trust knowledge gathered through echoes and numbers rather than human eyes. The deepest trenches were named long before anyone could actually see them. For much of history, the deepest places in the ocean were known only through inference and patience. Expeditions dropped sounding lines and later took echo measurements, then compared their results across many crossings to locate the most extreme depths. Names were assigned to features that no human eye had ever witnessed. which is a wonderfully bold thing to do. It is a little like naming a mountain you have never seen, based only on how far your measurement keeps falling into the dark. Those names carried stories and quiet rivalries, marking achievements and honoring the ships that found them. Only much later did cameras and deep-diving vehicles confirm what the numbers had long suggested. The sequence itself is telling. In the story of the sea, knowledge often arrives first as measurement and only later as sight. The trenches were real long before they were ever visible. Reading the magnetism of the seafloor confirmed the drifting of continents. At sea, scientists began towing instruments that could sense tiny changes in the Earth's magnetic field, and what they found over the mid-ocean ridges was startlingly orderly. Bands of stronger and weaker magnetism ran alongside one another like stripes, and the pattern repeated in a mirrored way on both sides of a ridge. Rock on the seafloor had locked in the direction of the magnetic field at the moment it cooled, and since the planet's field flips from time to time, those stripes formed a kind of timeline written into stone. The symmetry implied motion, as if fresh seafloor was being created at the ridge and pushed slowly outward in both directions. This was no hunch from a desk. It was evidence gathered by ships crossing the same lines again and again, checking that the pattern held. When those stripes finally made sense, drifting continents stopped being an argument and became a map of how the Earth renews itself. Hydrothermal vents overturned our idea of where life can survive. For a long time it seemed obvious that life ultimately depended on sunlight. Deep ocean expeditions shattered that assumption when they discovered vents, places where heated water pours from the seafloor like an unseen spring. Around these vents, scientists found dense communities of creatures thriving in total darkness, supported by chemistry rather than by the sun. The energy came from reactions involving compounds in the vent fluids, and microbes formed the base of an entire food web. The discovery was dramatic because it changed two great stories at once. It changed what we believed the deep sea could hold, and it changed what we believed life itself required. The vents even suggested a new possibility for life beyond our own planet, since other worlds might hide dark oceans warmed by internal heat. A dive meant to study geology ended up expanding biology and imagination in a single breath. Black smokers build stone chimneys in surprisingly fast motion. Some hydrothermal vents do not flow like a clear spring. They erupt as black smokers, where superheated water loaded with dissolved minerals meets the near-freezing sea and instantly precipitates a dark, billowing cloud. As those particles fall, they build towering chimneys that can grow and collapse over remarkably short spans of time. Watching this is a little like watching a mountain build itself, not across ages but within the span of human attention. The chemistry is intense, as metals and sulfur compounds join and separate in ways that leave layered mineral deposits, forming rich structures on the seafloor. Expeditions that found these black smokers realized they were witnessing an active factory, one that turns the Earth's internal heat into new materials in real time. The sites hold sharp contrasts, since one step from a vent can be near freezing while the vent fluid runs hot enough to cook in an instant. Drilling cores turns seafloor mud into a record of ancient climate. When a drilling ship pulls a long cylinder of sediment from the seafloor, it is really bringing up time itself, stacked in delicate layers. Year after year, tiny shells, dust, ash, and fragments of life settle and compress, leaving a quiet archive that can stretch back millions of years. Scientists read these cores like a slow diary. Changes in the microscopic fossils reveal shifts in ocean temperature and chemistry. Variations in grain size hint at stronger winds or different currents, and distinct layers of ash can tie the sediment to known eruptions, anchoring the timeline. What makes this so powerful is that the ocean gathers signals from wide regions rather than a single coast, so a core taken far from land can still record changes in ice, rain, and global circulation. In the story of exploration, drilling turned a voyage into a kind of deep listening where mud becomes testimony. The deep scattering layer fooled sonar until it turned out to be alive. Early sonar operators noticed something strange. Signals bounced back from a broad layer in the water, as if the seafloor had suddenly risen. Yet the depth of this false bottom changed from hour to hour. At first it looked like a phantom, unsettling for anyone relying on sonar for navigation or detection. The truth proved even more fascinating. The layer was made of living creatures, many of them small, that reflected sound. Even more astonishing was their daily movement. As daylight faded, they rose toward the surface to feed, and when morning returned, they sank again into darker depths, forming a vast migrating band. This is one of the largest animal migrations on the whole planet, and it happens out of sight every single day. The discovery linked military technology to biology, and it reminded explorers that the ocean holds moving architecture made of life itself. The first CTD casts revealed the ocean's hidden layers. A lowered instrument package measures conductivity, temperature, and depth as it descends through the sea like a careful probe. What comes back is not a single number, but a vertical portrait of the water. Layers appear plainly. Some are warm and mixed, some are cold and stable, and some mark sharp boundaries where the density changes fast. Those boundaries matter deeply, since they shape how nutrients move, how sound travels, and how great masses of water circulate between basins. Before such casts, sailors could feel the surface conditions and only guess at what lay below. These profiles turned guessing into structure. Scientists could compare one station with another across an entire expedition, watching the ocean change not only across distance but through depth. It also made the study of the sea more precise for future work, since the same instrument could be used again and again, lowering a question into darkness and drawing back a clear answer. A fleet of drifting floats turned the ocean into a living data stream. Instead of measuring the sea only where a ship happened to travel, these floats measure it while drifting day after day across vast regions. Each one follows a simple routine. It sinks to a set depth, drifts with the currents for a time, then rises while recording temperature and saltiness before transmitting its data and sinking once more. The result is a kind of global pulse of information, gathered in places and seasons where expedition ships rarely go. This changes how we understand the ocean's role in the climate, since the sea stores enormous amounts of heat and moves it around the planet. The floats make that storage measurable at scale, not as a single snapshot, but as ongoing change. They also change the feeling of exploration itself. The ocean is still immense, yet it is no longer silent between voyages, for the floats keep patiently watching. Modern remotely operated vehicles work for hours in darkness, guided from a bright ship above. Such a machine can descend miles into black water, where the pressure would crush a human body and no lungs could function. It carries cameras, lights, arms, and sensors, and sends everything it finds back through a long tether to the crew waiting at the surface. This creates a strange split reality. People stand in bright air, watching screens, while the vehicle moves through cold darkness lit only by its own lamps. Pilots learn to maneuver delicately, since a careless move can stir the sediment into a blinding cloud or damage fragile life. With robotic arms, they can lift a rock, gather a creature, or inspect a wreck with a precision that early expeditions could never have dreamed of. These vehicles also change who can take part, since scientists, students, and the public can all watch discoveries unfold live. The deep feels a little less distant when you can see it in real time. Satellites now measure the sea by tiny changes in its height. From orbit, spacecraft can measure the height of the ocean's surface with astonishing precision, and those small differences in height tell surprisingly large stories. The sea rises and falls with melting ice and warming water, but it also bulges and dips because currents and winds pile water up in some regions and draw it down in others. Turning those patterns into maps reveals features like swirling eddies and boundary currents as gentle changes in surface height. This is remarkable because it lets us see motion without watching a single wave. It also helps connect the surface to the deep, since a raised surface can indicate warmer water below, while a depressed one can signal colder, denser water. For the story of exploration, satellites mark a new era in which the sea can be read everywhere. including places too dangerous or too remote for any ship to reach. Autonomous gliders now cross entire basins in near silence, like slow underwater kites. An ocean glider does not roar along with propellers, it slides. By subtly changing its buoyancy, it rises and sinks, and it turns that gentle vertical motion into forward movement with a pair of wings. The result is slow, efficient travel that can last for weeks or even months, covering great distances while gathering data all the way. Gliders measure temperature, saltiness, oxygen, and other quiet signals, building a moving picture of conditions across seasons and storms. Because they make so little noise, they can study areas where a loud ship would disturb marine life, and they can reach places too dangerous or too costly for a crewed vessel to patrol. What is most captivating is their patience. A glider keeps going when a human crew would need rest, and it notices gradual changes that a short cruise would miss. It is exploration handed to a tireless machine that drifts, dives, reports, and keeps on learning. Deep-sea trawls pulled up creatures that looked like inventions. When early expeditions dragged their nets through deep water, many expected emptiness, since sunlight never reaches those depths, and people long assumed that life could not thrive there. Then the trawls came up heavy, dripping with animals that seemed to break the rules of familiar nature. Some were translucent, some had enormous mouths, and some carried their own light like floating lanterns. The shock was not only in how they looked, it challenged the very idea that the deep ocean was barren, suggesting instead that life could adapt to cold, pressure, and darkness in ways no one had imagined. Each haul became a moment of suspense, because nobody knew what form might rise from the black water next. These discoveries also raised new questions about how such animals find food and reproduce in the dark. The deep began to feel less like a void and more like a hidden, teeming world. Coral reefs grow slowly, yet they can vanish in a single season. A reef can look as permanent as stone, but expeditions revealed a very different truth. Much of it is built by countless tiny animals laying down their skeletons a fraction of an inch at a time, season after season. That slow construction can take centuries to create the great structures that shelter fish and protect coastlines. Then a single heat wave, a surge of pollution, or a violent storm can damage that structure in a matter of weeks. Researchers who return to the same reef sites across many years see this contrast with painful clarity. A reef can be a thriving city of color and sound one year, and a pale, brittle place struggling to recover the next. That discovery changed how people think about time and nature. The ocean can build with immense patience, and it can also undo its work quickly, so that losing a reef means losing history that cannot be replaced on any human schedule. Charting the Great Barrier Reef took years of patient soundings. The reef is not one neat line on a map, but a sprawling maze of shoals, channels, and sudden shallows that can punish any ship trusting the wrong chart. Surveying it demanded repeated passes, careful soundings, and the humility to return and correct what earlier work had missed. Crews had to read the color of the water, watch where the waves broke, and measure the depth again and again, while the weather and the tide tried to scramble their results. The patience was far from academic, since accurate maps meant safer passage for everyone who followed, from coastal traders to research vessels. The work also revealed how complex reef systems truly are, shifting and growing and scattering hazards across wide areas that look calm from a distance. Charting such a place was like drawing a living labyrinth. The accomplishment was not a single dramatic moment, but persistence layered patiently over years. The Galapagos became a great laboratory reached only by hard sailing. Reaching those islands once meant committing to long days of open water with uncertain winds and little chance of resupply. That very isolation is what made them so scientifically powerful. They functioned like a set of natural experiments, where similar creatures could diverge on different islands under different conditions. Expeditions carried observers who compared the patterns, asked uncomfortable questions, and carried those questions back to the wider world. The islands also forced people to look closely, because when you are far from home, every detail matters. and shorelines, food sources, and animal behavior become more than curiosities. Over time, the Galapagos earned a reputation as a place where enormous ideas can begin from small observations, a finch's beak, or a lizard's habits, or the way a plant is distributed. The sea journey was part of the lesson. Isolation can concentrate insight, and distance can sharpen attention until a whole worldview shifts. Ships at sea recorded the eruption of Krakatoa as it happened. When the volcano erupted, the event was not contained by geography, and ships became witnesses, not by choice, but because the ocean carried the disturbance outward. Mariners reported thunderous sounds, an unnatural darkness, and waves that did not behave like ordinary storm swells. Some crews felt strange changes in pressure, and some sailed into floating rafts of pumice that turned the water into a gritty, unstable surface. The sea itself became a messenger, transmitting great waves across vast distances and making faraway coastlines part of the disaster. These shipboard observations mattered because they captured timing, direction, and scale in places without any land-based instruments. They also showed how deeply connected ocean hazards can be, since a volcano could reach into shipping lanes and distant shores through the medium of water. When the Earth reshapes itself, the ocean helps spread the news, sometimes before any official report can be written. The first ocean census was stitched together from thousands of voyages. No single ship could ever catalogue the ocean's life, because the sea is far too large and too varied. A true census had to be assembled like a quilt, with thousands of voyagers collecting samples, recording sightings, tagging animals, and comparing habitats across many years. Each expedition added a few tiles to a mosaic that only slowly became recognizable. Researchers learned where biodiversity concentrates, where great migrations pass, and how ecosystems differ between coasts, open water, and the deep zones far below. The work also exposed how much remained unknown, since many species had never been described, and many regions had barely been sampled. That is part of what makes the effort so captivating, for it turned exploration into a collaboration across oceans and generations. The census was not only about naming creatures, it was about understanding their relationships and their abundance, and about noticing gently what is beginning to disappear. One great voyage sampled the plankton and quietly redrew the ocean's family trees. Plankton can be microscopic, yet they steer the food webs of the whole sea and shape the very air above it. A modern expedition treated these tiny drifters as worthy of a grand journey, collecting samples across many regions and conditions. By reading the genetic material within them, researchers found surprising diversity and unexpected links between organisms that looked alike but were only distantly related. In some cases, the results reshaped how scientists classify ocean life. Since the genes revealed hidden branches that ordinary observation had missed, the work also showed how plankton communities shift with temperature, nutrients, and currents, making them sensitive messengers of change. What feels almost dizzying is the scale. A single jar of seawater can hold an entire universe of predators, prey, and partners. Sample that universe patiently enough, and a whole living network begins to appear, one that quietly supports the health of the sea. Expeditions found plastic in the deepest trenches on Earth. For a long time, the deepest trenches were imagined as remote and protected, shielded by the sheer difficulty of reaching them. Getting there requires specialized vessels and careful planning, so it was tempting to picture those places as clean by default. Expeditions shattered that comfort by finding plastic debris and tiny fragments even in the deepest zones of the sea. The discovery is not only disheartening, it is revealing, for it shows how currents, sinking particles, and food webs can carry human material into the most isolated environments on the planet. It also reframes pollution as a three-dimensional problem, since plastic does not stay near the shore or the surface. It travels, breaks apart, and enters ecosystems that are slow to recover from any disturbance. When scientists pull samples from extreme depths and find traces of everyday packaging, it changes the very scale of our responsibility for the sea. The search for a lost airliner became one of the largest sea surveys ever attempted. When an airliner vanished over the Indian Ocean, The sea became an immense investigation scene with almost no obvious clues. Search teams had to combine satellite data, drift modeling, sonar mapping, and deep survey work across an enormous area. The scale of the effort was staggering, not because ships were chasing a visible target, but because they were trying to find something small on a seafloor that seemed to stretch on forever. Each new pass produced maps of underwater terrain that had never been charted in such detail, quietly turning tragedy into exploration. The work also exposed how difficult the deep ocean remains to search, even with modern technology. Since weather limits operations, equipment can fail, and every echo might be rock, debris, or nothing at all. The search became a lesson in patience and uncertainty, showing that the ocean can still keep its secrets. The first women oceanographers had to fight for a place aboard, then reshaped the science. They faced barriers that sound absurd today, yet were painfully real. Some were told a ship had no room for them, or that their presence would distract the crew, or even that a woman aboard was unlucky. Even after earning degrees and publishing careful work, they could still be barred from research vessels by tradition rather than merit. So many built other paths. They studied the samples that others brought back, ran laboratories ashore, and pressed for the changes that would finally open sea time to more people. When those doors at last began to crack open, they did not arrive as mere visitors. They came with questions that reshaped whole fields, from the ecology of plankton to the chemistry of seawater to the mapping of the deep. Their story matters because the history of exploration is not only about oceans, it is also about who is allowed to ask the ocean its questions. Marie Tharp mapped the ocean floor and was doubted for years. She worked with sounding data that looked, to many people, like nothing more than scattered numbers, and she patiently turned those numbers into a coherent picture of the seafloor. As she traced the profiles across the Atlantic, a persistent feature began to appear. A ridge with a deep central valley running down its length. The idea that the seafloor held a continuous rift was hard for many to accept, and her interpretation was often dismissed before it was even properly weighed. Still, she kept drawing, cross-checking, and refining her work. When her maps were finally paired with other lines of evidence, they helped prove that the ocean floor was dynamic rather than static. What makes her story so gripping is that the discovery came not from a single dramatic dive, but from pattern recognition, patience, and quiet integrity. Her work shows that exploration can happen at a desk and still reshape how humanity pictures the Earth. Indigenous wayfinding survived colonization, and it is being taught again. For many ocean cultures, navigation was never only a technical skill, it was identity, inheritance, and the shared memory of a community. Colonization disrupted that long chain, replacing local knowledge with imported instruments and imposed routes, and in many places it tried to dismiss ancestral methods as mere superstition. Yet the knowledge endured, carried in stories, in practice, and in people who refused to let it fade. In recent decades, revival voyages and training programs have brought this way of knowing back into the open, with students once again learning to read the star paths, the swells, and the winds through direct experience at sea. These journeys are not performances for show. They are proofs of skill and acts of cultural healing. They also widen how we define science itself, since observation, repetition, and apprenticeship are scientific habits even when they live far from any university. The ocean, it turns out, has always been known in more than one way. Every new ocean map still begins with a single measurement. Modern ships can paint the seafloor with sweeping beams of sound and sophisticated sensors, yet the heart of the task remains a question asked in the oldest possible way. How deep is it, right here? The earliest answer was a weighted line lowered until it touched bottom, and that act created the first honest contact between a ship and the unseen world beneath it. It also created a discipline of verification, since a map is not imagination but measurement repeated until it agrees with itself. Even now, calibration and direct sampling still matter, as instruments are checked and the ocean is tested to confirm what remote sensing suggests. The romance of exploration often looks toward distant horizons, but this is the quieter truth. New knowledge usually begins with a single point measured carefully. Drop the line, record the depth, then do it again somewhere else, and slowly the sea becomes a chart. As we come to the end of our journey, notice how wide the ocean feels now, not only as water, but as history. We drifted out with the early navigators who trusted the stars, the wind, and their own patient memory, and we felt invisible islands hidden in the pattern of the waves. We followed empires that treated sea routes like arteries, carrying grain, silk, silver, and sorrow from one port to the next. We watched a lonely clock keep perfect time through a storm, and we saw how a single fruit could quietly widen the reach of the world. We drifted into the polar margins where the ice does not negotiate, and where survival depended on humility, teamwork, and knowledge earned the hard way. Then we sank into the deep, where the seafloor revealed hidden mountains, mirrored magnetic stripes, and strange creatures thriving without any sunlight at all, in a world that had been living quietly beneath every ship all along. If you enjoyed this slow voyage through the past, you can support the channel by liking, subscribing, or leaving a gentle comment below. It helps these bedtime journeys find the people who need them, one sleepy soul at a time. And if you are still awake, there will be another quiet journey waiting for you on the screen, ready to carry you onward whenever you wish. But for now, there is nothing at all you need to navigate. Let your jaw unclench, let your shoulders drop, feel your breathing find an easier rhythm, in and out, like a tide that knows exactly where it belongs. Imagine the last light fading softly behind a distant horizon, and a steady ship moving forward without effort across a calm and darkening sea. Let the maps fold themselves away. Let the harbor lights blur and dim. Sleep well, and good night.